Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. I'm Frater Eleftheria, and tonight I've got a very intriguing video for you. This is drawing on my understanding of biblical prophecy as well as international politics and geopolitics to explain how events that are happening in the world right now very closely resemble a specific and very significant prophecy in the Bible. That is the prophecy of the war of Gog and Magog. This is a prophecy that is associated with the end times, one of the final events, one of the final upheavals in the world before the coming of the Messianic Age and the redemption of humanity, but also some kind of dark times that we have to work through before that. Now, a couple of disclaimers. With this video and its content, I'm not saying that the events happening in the world right now are definitely the fulfillment of the prophecy of Gog and Magog, just that there is a very, very close resemblance to them. And the intention of this video is not to say that God is against any particular people and that God supports the political designs of any particular group of nations over another. It's just to lay out the scenario and look at how closely it resembles world events today. And as to the true reason for that, that's something that is beyond human understanding. And, you know, the divine is accepting of all people and welcoming of all those who will repent. Now, with that out of the way, I'll go through what the prophecy says first of all, and then I'll go through how in the world today this might be being fulfilled before our very eyes. So the prophet Ezekiel, who is most well known to people as the person who gave us the image of the biblically accurate angel, the terrifying form of the angels as they appear to the prophets in the form of wheels and eyes and living creatures with four heads and that sort of thing. But Ezekiel made a number of other prophecies. He prophesied about the future temple in a quasi-symbolic kind of a way, but he also made prophecies about world events that would face the nation of Israel in the future, and which would come to pass right before the final redemption of Israel, but also of humanity as a whole. And that particular event that Ezekiel describes is known as the War of Gog and Magog. Who are Gog and Magog? Gog is an individual described as the prince of a people, Magog. And not only that, Gog seems to be the leader of a coalition of nations who are all united against Israel in the last days, some of whom send troops to Israel to attack it or militarily attack it, some who don't necessarily do that, and some who send armies out and some who don't necessarily do that. So there's a lot to kind of interpret there, but to give you a better idea of the coalition of nations that is referred to in this prophecy, I'll read from Ezekiel 38, which says, "And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him, and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and I will turn thee back and put hooks into thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armour, even a great company with buckles and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer." Now, the reference to Ethiopia here is really a reference to a nation called Cush, which is not necessarily the same as Ethiopia, and the reference to Libya is a reference to a nation called Put, which again may be Libya, but not necessarily. I'll get into that later. The chapter goes on. "Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee." And so this coalition of nations that is described in Ezekiel comes up against Israel in the last days, in a time when Israel, one, exists, and two, is experiencing relative security. And they come against Israel militarily and are astonishingly and almost miraculously defeated or stifled. And many people have started to talk about this prophecy again since the events of October 7, because, as it happens, this very specific scenario, this very specific coalition of nations, seems to currently be aligned against Israel in the current conflict that has emerged. But there's differing views of this, and sometimes it can be quite confusing. So I wanted to have a go at explaining my own understanding based on my own research of how the scenario might fit. And what I've found is that the current events of the world, the current geopolitical situation in the Middle East and to the north of the Middle East, does indeed accurately reflect the scenario of Gog and Magog. But before I explain why, let's just identify these different nations. We've been given the nation of Magog as a major player, which is home of the chief, Gog, who is also, in addition to being the ruler of Magog, is also the prince of Meshech and Tubal, two other nations in the northern parts. And there's also mention of Cush, Put, the house of Togarmah, Gomer, and of course Persia. So how do we interpret this? How can we identify each of these individual nations? Well, the first thing you need to understand about Ezekiel's prophecy is that the names that he is mentioning come from the table of nations in the book of Genesis. They are the descendants of Noah, who went off to different parts of the world after the flood and repopulated them, and it names a number of names of people who went on to have descendants who populated a particular region of the world. And so by understanding where each of these descendants of Noah, mostly descendants of Japheth, one of Noah's three sons, understanding where their descendants populated is how we can understand which region of the world is being indicated. So Magog is often associated with modern-day Russia, Meshech and Tubal with the nations of the Caucasus, particularly Armenia and Georgia. The house of Togarmah, or Beth Togarmah, is also associated with the nations of the Caucasus, particularly Armenia and Georgia. Persia is, of course, modern-day Iran. And Gomer is said to be either in Turkey or in the region of sort of southern Ukraine around here, or the very north of the Caucasus. Tubal and Togarmah are also sometimes associated with Turkey. The descendants of those individuals from the Table of Nations also made it to Turkey. But for the scenario to play out, Turkey doesn't necessarily have to come into play. And so there's two other nations that are mentioned. One is Cush and the other is Put. Put is fairly easy. It's a nation in North Africa, which most scholars of the Bible agree is modern-day Libya. Cush is a bit more ambiguous. Cush was quite a large nation. At one time, they were so big and powerful that they controlled Egypt, one of the great African nations of history. They encompassed a lot of modern-day Ethiopia, which is why in the Bible Cush is often translated to Ethiopia, including in Ezekiel 38. But they also covered the area of Sudan, and the individual Cush from Noah's Table of Nations had a son, Sabta, who actually settled this southwestern corner of the Arabian Peninsula. So the peoples of Cush extended all the way to this particular part of Arabia, of the Arabian Peninsula. So I'll go ahead and write their names on the board so that you can continue to keep track of exactly what's going on with this scenario. Okay, so for the war of Gog and Magog to be happening now, we would have to be able to pinpoint a scenario in the world where the leader of Russia is leading a coalition of nations who are attacking Israel. Well, as it so happens, Israel has found itself in a state of war recently, specifically at war with groups that act as Iran's proxies, and Iran in turn is allies with Russia, one of Russia's major allies in the region, and there's a very close relationship between those two. Russia is, of course, a major player, a very powerful country in the world, and headed by Vladimir Putin. So that, in a superficial way, seems to fit the scenario of Gog and Magog. But what about the specifics of this scenario? Is there a way to incorporate all of these players in the way that they need to be incorporated in order for the prophecy to be fulfilled? Well, let's have a look. We've already mentioned the main aggressor in this situation, Persia, Iran, who 1 or 2 weeks ago, as of the date of filming this video, which is the 25th of April 2024, Persia fired missiles towards Israel. And before that, there was an escalation in conflict in the region following the October 7 attacks upon Israel by Hamas, who are funded and resourced by Iran. Hezbollah has had a role to play as well, also backed by Iran. So from October 7 until now, it's been like a proxy war with Iran, and then there was an Iranian strike against Israel. So we already have the nation of Persia militarily taking an aggressive stance, taking a stance of war towards Israel. So that element, at least insofar as Iran is concerned, Persia is concerned, is fulfilled. But when Iran launched its missile attack on Israel, that wasn't the only nation that was involved, or not the only political force that was involved. Some of the missiles came from, like, Iraq, which actually used to be a part of the Persian Empire. But more interestingly, some of the missiles came from a rebel group known as the Houthi rebels, who have been allied with Iran, have been engaging in military action in support of Hamas since the October 7 attacks. And the place where the Houthi rebels are based is actually that very tip of the Arabian Peninsula, which was inhabited by the descendants of Cush. So both Iran and the Houthi rebels have militarily attacked the nation of Israel. So those two elements of the prophecy are fulfilled. What about the nation of Put? What about Libya? Libya haven't been aggressors in this conflict. However, there may be another way in which Libya could fulfill the prophecy, which says that these nations, Cush and Put, are with thee. Not necessarily that they are the ones that are involved in the military attack, but that they give some form of support to enable that attack. And as it so happens, since the fall of Gaddafi, after the Arab Spring, and some US military intervention, Libya has been in a state of conflict between different groups, including Islamist rebels, who are backed by Qatar and Iran. And in fact, one of the major sources of arms supplied to Hamas, some of which may indeed have been used in the October 7 attacks, was from these Libyan rebels. We have Libya playing a role in the present conflict, together with Persia and with Cush, with Iran and the Houthis. Okay, so all of the players in North Africa and the Middle East are accounted for and seem to be able to play some role which is in fulfillment of the Gog and Magog prophecy. But none of this at all involves Russia or the Caucasus or indeed Turkey or the territory of southern and eastern Ukraine, which was once belonging to the Cimmerians, who were the descendants of Gomer. But some of the names of places in the world that I've mentioned, talking to these parts of the prophecy, talking about these nations, probably sound familiar. Southern Ukraine, Georgia, Russia. As it so happens, there is another conflict happening in the world right now in the form of the Russia-Ukraine war. But that's got nothing to do, seemingly, with the events in the Middle East. But what if the Russia-Ukraine war and the Iran-Israel conflict are more connected than, in fact, we first realize? Well, as I mentioned earlier in this video, Russia and Iran are very close allies now. Russia was, before the Ukraine war, was trying to kind of curry a bit more kind of a favorable relationship with Israel and cooperate with them in terms of the unrest in Syria. Whereas now, Russia has really turned on Israel and is much more invested in Iran as an ally against the interests of Israel. And so we have these two nations, Russia and Iran, that have a joint interest on the world stage. Not only do they have joint interests, but they've got a history of close cooperation and collaboration. And they've also got a history of joint goals in terms of their global political agenda of challenging the Western world. But we can draw an even more specific and concrete connection between the Russia-Ukraine war and the events surrounding Israel that are currently going on. I found this article when I was researching this video on the Jerusalem Post, written by one Seth J. Fransman, published on the 24th of April 2022, so almost exactly 2 years ago, long before the October 7 attacks. But in the midst of the Ukraine war, and the whole premise of Mr. Fransman's article is how the war in Ukraine increases the threat that Iran will try and attack Israel in the Middle East. How prophetic were those words? There are a couple of different ways that Russia's war in Ukraine has created the opening and set the scene that allowed Iran to attack Israel. First of all, by Russia invading Ukraine and compelling the Western nations, particularly the United States, to give aid to Ukraine so that it could stand up against Russia and stand a chance of defending its territory, the US's sights were turned away from the Middle East and away from Middle Eastern politics, away from Israel, toward the situation in Ukraine, giving resources to Ukraine instead of to Israel. Israel is very dependent on US aid, including military aid. So it was a big deal for the US's attention to be turned elsewhere. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine set a precedent for all of the other nations in the world that resent the Western international order and want to try their luck at challenging and pushing back at the Western international order. And when Putin invaded, it was more than just about Russia and Ukraine. Putin's whole mindset, his whole worldview is based on a sense of being humiliated by the Western world when the Soviet Union fell and wanting to take revenge against the entire West, which includes the United States and NATO and the European Union, but also includes Israel. And the attack on Ukraine was a call to arms. It was a rallying cry for all of the nations that were allied with Putin, who were hostile to the West, to take a stand against any of the Western nations within their sphere of influence that were their competitor, which of course includes Iran, who is, the main competitor for influence in the Middle East with Israel, who is, of course, allied with Western interests. And there is evidence that throughout the Russia-Ukraine war, and possibly even with the current situation in Israel, there has been close collaboration and cooperation between Iran and Russia. For one thing, the drones that were used to attack Ukraine by Russia were Iranian drones, purchased from Iran. And when the Iranian military launched their attack on Israel a couple of weeks ago, the military strategy that they used was almost a complete copy of a similar Russian strategy that had been employed in the Ukraine war. So Russia attacking Ukraine had been like a testing ground for the military strategy that Iran observed and then took and used against Israel. So there is a very clear connection between the Russia-Ukraine war and the events that have just occurred in the Middle East, which incorporates Russia. But the Ukraine war also had a number of other non-state actors. There were military corps who came from Georgia to help the Russian side, one of the nations that claims descent from Meshech, Tubal and Togarmah. There were also separatists in the south and east of Ukraine, which sided with Russia, identical with the territory that was known as Goma in the Bible. And so if you consider the Russia-Ukraine war and the attack by Iran and its proxies on Israel as part of the same event, then indeed we have the actors, all of the actors of Gog and Magog in play to fulfill the scenario of Gog and Magog. Other people have pointed to the nature of the conflict between Iran and Israel directly, and pointed to that as a fulfillment of the prophecy of Gog and Magog for a number of reasons. First of all, because it was over quickly, and the war of Gog and Magog was expected to be over quickly. Also because the armies of Gog that do attack Israel are described as coming like a cloud against Israel, which some have interpreted as like a description of missiles coming towards Israel, like a cloud of missiles. There's other language such as fire falling from the sky, which could refer to missiles being shot down. There's other language such as the bow of Gog, the arrow of Gog being struck from his hand, very similar to a missile in terms of its symbolism. And some of this language does have to be considered symbolically. Obviously, we don't have horses and chariots and swords and things like that in modern warfare, but that's not a problem because Ezekiel's prophecies are semi-symbolic anyway. And then also the fact that the defeat of Gog's army, one of the people serving Gog, seemed miraculous. And in the missile attack from Iran on Israel, we have elements of that as well. Many commentators have pointed out the high unlikelihood that Israel would have been able to completely fend off Iran's attack. But as it so happens, 99% of all of the missiles sent by Iran was shot down, and only one of them even injured a person, and that person was a Bedouin. So it didn't turn out very well for that civilian, as with so many of the civilians in these conflicts. But Israel certainly came out of it unscathed. And people have looked at this, commentators have looked at this and said that this does seem like a miracle because the defense system that Israel was using shouldn't have had any more than a 90% accuracy in terms of its defense capabilities. And that would be if Israel was extremely lucky. So that element of the prophecy seems to be fulfilled as well. Now, a lot of people look at this prophecy of Gog and Magog. They see that Gog is the chief in this coalition of nations and that he is the leader of Magog. And so they assume that the fulfillment of this prophecy must be a Russian military attack on Israel. But the prophecy doesn't actually say that. It says that there will be a coalition of nations. Some of those nations will militarily attack Israel, not necessarily all of them, and not necessarily Russia. Although, as part of the broader conflict of Gog and Magog, Russia does mobilize troops somewhere, together with Meshech and Tubal. It isn't necessarily the nation that attacks Israel. However, in order to fulfill the prophecy, Gog, the leader of Russia, needs to be the ringleader behind the whole scenario. The Russian mobilization of troops, as well as the Persian or Iranian attack on Israel. Can we say that about the current situation? At first glance, it doesn't seem likely. It seems as though the Ayatollah of Iran was acting on a whim just because he wanted to attack Israel. He was doing his thing over here, Putin was doing his thing over here, and that's that. But I think it may emerge that Putin had more of a hand in the events that have engulfed the Middle East recently than perhaps we first realized. And there have been other commentators who aren't out there with weird theories who have made the same assertion. I've seen at least 2 articles on The Hill that have made this very same analysis. And if you look at who the leader of Russia is now, Vladimir Putin, he is known for being very scheming, very conniving, for having his hands in all kinds of situations of political instability across the world, including the US election in 2016. And always he's sneakily interfering in world affairs elsewhere, always with the goal of undermining the West. So it certainly wouldn't be beyond him to be ultimately the person who is behind Iran's attack on Israel and Hamas's attack on Israel. And he's certainly the biggest player in this coalition of forces against the West. So it would be no surprise if there was some broader, if not overt plot, a broader understanding between friends, with ultimately Putin being the ringleader and Putin being the initiator of all of the trouble in the first place. Another thing to consider is that the attack of Hamas on Israel couldn't have come at a more perfect time for Putin, at a time when his war against Ukraine was starting to stagnate in terms of being able to gain militarily. Diverting the US's attention away from Ukraine towards Israel, one of its most prized allies, couldn't have come at a better timing strategically for Putin, who was looking for an opportunity for something about the international political situation to change in his favor. And when the October 7 attacks happened, Putin got that, and now the Western world found itself fighting a war on 2 fronts, which any military strategist knows is bad for the person fighting on those 2 fronts. So the situation that unfolded on October 7 was perfect for Putin in terms of his interests on the world stage. Did that happen by accident? You be the judge of that. But to demonstrate that there might be more of a connection between Putin and the events that have happened in Israel recently, I'll just leave you with this one little fact. October 7 is Putin's birthday. So do I think that the events in the Middle East right now and elsewhere in the world fulfill the prophecy of Gog and Magog? I think they do. I think that if they don't fulfill them, then they give a very graphic precursor or prefiguring of those events in a way which is truly astonishing to me. If there was an escalation of the present conflict, that might be a better representation of Gog and Magog. If there's some future war where all of the same alliances come into play again, that might be a better fulfillment of the scenario. But from what I can see, the present events stretching over the last months and in fact the last couple of years tick all of the boxes in terms of a literal fulfillment of the war of Gog and Magog. And to me, it's just astonishing. You know, I've always been fascinated by Bible prophecy, but I've always kind of looked down my nose in a way at people who expected the literal fulfillment of Bible prophecies. I just thought that it was beyond the pale to expect these things to happen literally. Symbolically, maybe, you know, figures such as Gog are just a symbol of, like, you know, the evil that men do, to quote Shakespeare. But a literal fulfillment, that's a bit far-fetched, that's a bit simplistic. But I'm staggered to see that this particular prophecy of Ezekiel seems to be happening, unfolding in a literal way. And it's certainly shaken my worldview, and it's made me rethink the way that the divine intervenes in history and what might be around the corner for the human race, which is very sobering in terms of what might be around the corner for us as a species, but it also brings me great hope because I know how the story ends. And so that is the big takeaway from all of this. It's not about, you know, singling out any particular nation or any particular people as evil or anything like that, but it's just to say that there is a greater force at work. There is a spiritual force at work in history today, and we should pay attention to that. And we should pay attention to the words of the prophets, the things that they warned against, and the things that they called us to do to live a moral life and to get closer to the divine. Now more than ever is that important, as we find ourselves quite possibly in what the prophets described as the last days. If you've enjoyed this, please leave a like. Please also subscribe to my channel to support my work. You can subscribe to me on Odyssey as well, and you can click join down below if you want to become a member on my channel, and you can click the thanks button down below if you'd like to send me super thanks. But thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.